Thank you. That was a great talk, Martin. I'm very happy to be here. I did my PhD right across the street in Building 32, so it's good to be back. I recently started at the Wu Tsai Institute at Yale University, and I would love to tell you a little bit more about the institute at the end of my talk, because it's a new institute, and so it would be great for everyone to know about it. Okay, so today I'm excited to tell you a little bit about what my lab's working on. It's a new lab, so bear with me. I want to start us off with a video because it's always good to wake people up. So here we see a wolf pack chasing a hare. The hare has no chance, by the way, just a spoiler alert, it's not going to survive. But I want you to consider what the task of any one wolf here is. It has to take in the visual signals of the hare, has to understand that it's prey, and make the right muscle movements in order to get it to that prey. And here we see two wolves having the same goal, or multiple wolves having the same goal. Are they, is there neural activity performing in the same way in order to guide them? You know, what are the inter-subject variability or differences? And importantly, what are the similarities in how they're making these movements or how they're achieving their goal? And as we saw here, they actually end up cooperating, right? Multiple wolves work together. One of them was going in one direction, the other one went in the other one in order to achieve that goal. So how do they socially cooperate? How does that actually happen? Well, these are big questions. I'm not claiming to answer any one of them in a very detailed manner, but these are the kinds of questions I think we should be going towards as a field. And how do we attack these questions at the level, at the level of the neural computations? We could record neural data. We don't do that yet in wolves, of course. We do that in more amenable species, potentially like mice. But what do we do with this data? Well, we could learn or train models on it, neural network models. We've seen a lot about that. And we've also seen, actually, that we potentially may need more information than just neural network models and data. Right? And especially because if we just have models trained on data, a lot of the times they don't generalize to conditions that have not been seen before, and they may not provide as much neural insight as we would like. Okay, so what can we do to help them out? We've seen multiple approaches today. I'm going to give you our approach in my lab. We can use biophysics that we know about. We can use models that we actually have. In this case, I'm going to be using existing known biophysics of the body in order to constrain our models. And we can use anatomical information that has been collected over decades in order to, again, constrain our models. Okay, so that's exactly what I'm going to be talking about. That's what my lab focuses on complex systems with, basically taming machine learning models with these kinds of constraints. Okay, so I'm going to lead you through 3 projects that we're currently working on. One is on monkey motor cortex, the other is on inter-subject similarity, and the third, which I probably won't have time to actually get into detail, but I'd love to talk offline, is how to understand social behavior. So I'll get started with the first one. Monkey motor cortex. Okay, so let's see. I want you to imagine that you're cycling. Okay, you're cycling forward, potentially, chasing someone, chasing a target. Now, if you know how to cycle at one speed and the target changes speeds, it's very easy for you to actually generalize and flexibly create movements at a different speed in order to track the target. That being said, your muscle activity while changing speeds actually differs a lot. It changes a lot, not just in the amount of time or the speed that that one cycle takes, but potentially the patterns of activity that you have to produce, as well as the amplitudes of the muscles, the different muscles, that has to change pretty drastically. But you're able to do this computation very flexibly. How does the brain actually do it, and how does and can we understand how that process happens in the motor cortex? Well, even though the muscle activity that you generate has to change very drastically in patterns, in fact, the relationship from the muscles to the kinematics stays the same, right? So because your body doesn't change at the time scale that we're thinking about, that relationship from the muscles to the kinematics, the biophysical system or the biomechanical system, that stays the same. The brain potentially knows about that kind of a system, has a model of that. Can we use that information to actually learn more generalizable models ourselves, machine learning models ourselves, because the brain presumably does. So how can we get better generalization in our models by incorporating these kinds of constraints into our models? So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, and to really answer how the motor cortex kind of behaves at different speeds. Abby Russo and Mark Churchland's lab collected data from a monkey, or two monkeys actually, that were trained to cycle forward in time. So this is the task that the monkeys were doing. They were cycling forward, and that created a forward movement in the virtual landscape. Their task was to actually stay on the target. So the white square that you're seeing, that's the target. Their task was to keep up with it. And so really, and then the target moved at different speeds, so the cycling movements were also created at different speeds. Okay, and at the same time, Abby recorded from the motor cortex and muscle activity, intramuscular EMG, single unit motor cortex and intramuscular EMG. So what does this activity look like? Here I'm showing you 3 different neurons. We see that there's varied patterns in the neural activity sometimes. And here the activity ranges from the fastest to the slowest. We binned the speeds into 8 different speeds. We binned the data into 8 different speeds. So in blue you see fast, in red you see slow. Some neurons are more activated during the fast speeds, some during the slow speeds, and some just completely change in pattern. So what we wanted to ask was, how do we actually explain this activity? How do we predict it? And it turns out that behavioral signals alone don't actually provide a very good model for predicting motor cortex activity. So here I'm showing you, we tried kinematic activity. We also tried muscle activity. And in fact, these signals alone don't get us to a good prediction of the neural activity. That being said, we would like a good prediction to be able to understand that neural activity, to be able to explain it. So what else can we do? Well, we took a goal-driven approach, which, again, we kind of got inspired by the work in the DiCarlo lab to explain visual hierarchies in the brain. So here we took a goal-driven approach to actually model the motor cortex. One of the goals of the motor cortex is to produce muscle signals. So we took that approach and said, okay, well, what would a network do if we're trying to model the motor cortex? What would a network do? Okay, so we can train a network. We can go from, for example, speed inputs, which are hypothesized inputs to the motor cortex, and produce muscle signals. So we can train this so that it actually does it. It will do it. It's a good pattern generator. Once the model is trained, we can see what the activity looks like in the states in each node of that recurrent neural network. So this is what it looks like. But is that model actually useful for anything other than actually performing a goal-driven approach, training, performing such that it reproduces muscles? Is that model still useful as a model of the motor cortex? And remember, we didn't actually use the motor cortex data in order to train this model. We just asked it to produce muscle data. So here, once the model is trained, we can then ask, does it do well at reconstructing the neural data that it hasn't seen before? And in fact, it does a better job than if we had just used the muscle data. And here we're taking the top dimensions of each of these sources in order to predict the firing rates, in order to actually see how well they fit this neural data. And it does so better than the EMG. The RNN fits the neural data better than the EMG at a population level as well. So it's clearly got some information about the muscle data that was not put in. Okay, so now it reconstructs the neural data. In fact, it also reconstructs this kind of structure that we see in neural data, as Mackenzie had pointed out this morning. This is the neural data, the motor cortex data at different speeds. The model, in fact, has a very similar speed axis and kind of the structure that you don't see in the muscle data at all. And this neural data now has some population-level activity that is recapitulated by the models themselves. So this is great. The goal-driven approach works, right? We have an understanding of what's happening in the neural space. We have a model that can fit neural data. Now, I ask you, is that it? So was that accurate in trying to be able to understand the goal of the motor cortex? And can we do better? So that's kind of what we started out by asking. And in fact, the goal of the motor cortex, while it's to produce muscle signals, it doesn't work in silo, right? It has inputs coming in, visual and proprioceptive. It also, all the signals that it outputs, it always does so through the musculoskeletal system. The muscles always need to go through that in order to get to the kinematics. Can we use that information to actually have better models of the motor cortex? We argue that yes, we can actually think of the biomechanical system that the motor pathways are driving as a dynamical system. It has mass, inertia, all these physical parameters. And the motor pathways themselves could be thought of as a controller for that dynamical system to reach the desired endpoint. Okay, so that's the kind of point of view that we're trying to instantiate. And this point of view is not new. It has been thought of before. But in an idealized setting, the musculoskeletal model has been thought of as linear, and the control policies have been thought of as optimal linear control policies. Now, that's great, but where exactly are these computations taking place in that controller? It's not very clearly known. And why is that important? Because if we want to now design stimulation for the cases where it may not work as well as it should, where do we actually stimulate? How do we stimulate? We need a very realizable model of the motor pathways in order to be able to do that. So that's what our goal is. So Noman Omani, a graduate student in the lab, started by trying to understand or instantiate this kind of a model, this feedback control model. How did he start? He first figured out how to model the musculoskeletal system to see if that could provide a better window into the motor cortex. So he took a model that was built in OpenSim and first transformed it to MuJoCo, which is a physics-based simulator that's commonly used in robotics, actually. But he kind of figured out a good muscle-based model in MuJoCo. And MuJoCo is open source, and so now we can actually play around with it. Okay, so he first created this muscle arm, and then to drive that musculoskeletal system in a high-dimensional space, he's trying to train neural networks, recurrent neural networks, because those are the ones that have been used before to model motor cortex, to be able to drive this musculoskeletal arm. Training-wise, what he does is use this deep reinforcement learning, which is, again, commonly used in robotics, in order to drive these systems through the desired states. So the goal here is to produce the right kinematics, and that is the experimentally recorded kinematics, using this RNN that goes through the actual musculoskeletal system. So that's the goal. So how does he do? Well, it trains pretty well. It's able to produce the kinematics as were recorded in the task. You see here that it kind of follows what the monkey was doing. It's cycling forwards, that's kind of a simple task, actually. And to you, this may not seem, super impressive. Like, you used all of these kinds of models, and all you're doing is this, forward and backward periodic cycle, right? It's not as impressive, but I want you to take a step back and think about where we started. So as a tangent, as an aside, I had a kid a year and a half ago. That's my kid. And when he, 2 months into when he was born, he was trying to make all these movements. He started going everywhere, right? So I think he's trying to reach for that bear there. He's completely missing, completely. And our models, when they were first initialized and started to train, they were just going everywhere, right? So you can't really tell where this thing wants to go. And that's how we all start. But 10 months after, he started making pretty good goal-directed movements. And he was able to reach for the food that he wanted. Our models only took a couple of hours, but they also got there. But I just want you to remember that this process takes a long time to actually train, and including us. Okay, so our models were able to produce the right kinematics. That's what we trained them to do. What else can they do? Well, these models are actually feedback models, right? So if there's a perturbation in the trajectory while during the movement, what we do is quickly correct for it. These models are also able to quickly correct and still keep going towards their desired trajectory. So that's great, which is not possible to think about in non-feedback models. Okay, what about actually fitting neural data or trying to understand how much of a window they can provide for neural data? They provide a much better fit to the neural data than if we just had the kinematics or the muscle data. So here on the x-axis are the comparisons. On the y-axis is how well our model does. Each dot here is a neuron, and it's basically the R squared for that neuron. So if we're above the dotted line, basically that's when our model's doing better. So for most of the neurons, our models are doing better as a fit for the neural data. But I talked about generalization. How well do these actually do for generalization? Well, we can test it out by seeing if they do better than if we didn't have the biomechanical model, if we didn't have this whole feedback control approach. And so what does that mean? That's actually just the open loop RNN that I showed you in the beginning. And in fact, these open loop RNNs, they do well for the conditions that they're trained in, but they don't generalize across conditions very well. And so here, for example, we tested it out for an unseen speed, but in the middle of two speeds that the model had seen before. And our models are doing better in that case. What if we test it out for speeds that are well outside the range of the speeds that the model has seen before, so extrapolation in some sense. And that's when our model actually really shines, or the RNNs really fail. But due to this knowledge of the biomechanics, we think the models are able to achieve much better generalization in this case. Okay, we can potentially also, by instantiating this idea that the neural network's nodes are actually the neuron's activity, we can actually constrain the neural network's nodes to follow neural activity as well, and then again test that on generalization, and we can do even better if we actually constrain our models with recorded neural data to produce neural data that has not been seen before. So that's also an exciting way forward, and we've been recently funded by the Brain Initiative to actually continue along these lines, and we're really happy to do that, and we're exploring multitask generalization with these as well. Okay, how much time do I have? 3 minutes, great. So I'm going to skip over a large part of the second part of the talk, sorry. But we're exploring inter-subject similarity in large-scale neural data. Here, that's only possible because we actually have large-scale neural data, like neuropixel recordings, like wide-field calcium imaging, and other kinds of really things that you heard yesterday, and today. So our take on modeling inter-subject similarity. Well, first of all, I just want to back up. Why do we want to model inter-subject similarity? So let's say I'm reaching for a cup, and Nima is reaching for a cup, right? There's some similarity, potentially, similarity in how we actually do it, because it's the same behavior. So why would we want to figure out what that similarity is now if we want to stimulate or understand how to stimulate in a novel subject, we can actually use this kind of a cross-subject model to first figure out a good stimulation design in this cross-subject model. So kind of like a transfer learning approach, but for brain data, or for brains. So that's a context of why we wanted to do this. This is a slide trying to show that current methods actually fail when trying to model this inter-subject variability or similarity because of differences in recording sessions. And so, for example, if we try to decompose wide-field calcium imaging data across two different mice, we'll get different components, right? So this is kind of like a basic problem. And similarly, if we try to model the activity, the behavior of 4 different mice, let's say in here, using one model, using a convolutional autoencoder in this case, convolutional variational autoencoder, the mice look very different, so we'll get different latents in the latent space. These latents are non-overlapping, so it'll be difficult to figure out when the mice are producing the same behavior. So what we would ideally want is methods that can actually work across subjects in a good way. So how are we doing it? We're using anatomy, like anatomical knowledge, as prior information to be able to decompose robustly across sessions and subjects. And for the behavioral side, we're building in constraints into our variational autoencoders in order to get latent spaces that are common across subjects, and those are orthogonal to latent spaces that are separate or constrained to be as separate as possible across subjects. And this is actually a result that's unsupervised. We don't tell the models, oh, there are 4 different subjects, this is where the data is coming from. They automatically pick out what is different because they're constrained to be as separate as possible in this latent space. Okay, details in these papers. Through these, we can actually figure out correlations across subjects, and they look, quite similar when the subjects are doing the same task. But how do they actually depend on the moment-to-moment behavior? It turns out that these correlations do depend quite a bit on what behavior that the mice are doing, which is pretty normal, I think. And we can quantify what the correlations are across subjects during the same when they're doing the same behavior. Okay, and again, why are we doing this? I'm an engineer by training. What can we do with this information or knowledge that we have gained across subjects, for example? Well, we can try to design stimulation methods to disrupt these kinds of movements. We can actually use them in our models to control future activity that can achieve desired behavior. Okay, so that's ongoing work with collaborators, and I will skip ahead and skip the social behavior. And go to, quickly, 1 minute, to the Wutsai Institute at Yale, which is a new institute that bridges neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and psychology. And for those who are looking for postdocs, there's a postdoc application ad open, and please apply. And those who are looking potentially for faculty positions, please apply. We're really expanding. It's a really great initiative. Please join me, and please talk to me if you'd like to know more. And with that, thank you so much to the organizers. And to all of you.
Setting up.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, really great work. So my question is basically in the model where you use the biomechanical model of VR.
Yeah.
And you tested whether you use the biomechanical model but keeping the feedback would result in the same accuracy basically.
That's a good question. So you would want to feed in directly the kinematics. So the problem is that then it's just basically a feed-forward model, I would say. I don't think it really models the feedback if you're not going through the right, if you don't have the right feedback signals. So we have kind of tried an approach that goes along that side. The activity that is learned by the neural networks quickly deteriorates depending on how much feedback you actually add, and I don't think it's a realistic model, and we can talk offline. So we could try to potentially model the biomechanics using another model and then do this approach, but I think we can talk as to pros and cons of that approach, yeah.